Let's review some key takeaways from this week's readings and videos related to the conquest of the Aztecs and the Inca. Let's begin with the person of Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador who led the conquest. Cortés was from a minor noble background in a region of Spain known as Extremadura. He was born in 1485. Extremadura is a hot, dry region with few economic opportunities beyond sheep and cattle herding, so it behooved Hernán Cortés to seek opportunities elsewhere. He arrived in Hispaniola in 1503 and became mayor of the small town of Santiago, Cuba in 1514. In 1519, he led the expedition to the Mexican coast that Spanish Governor Velázquez attempted to override at the last minute. So in a legal sense, the Cortés mission was rogue and borderline mutinous. He had 11 ships and 500 soldiers, along with some cannon, horses, and war dogs. His first stop was the Yucatan Peninsula, and next he founded the town of Veracruz, which translates as the True Cross. In a bold or perhaps desperate move, he scuttled his fleet to discourage his men from returning to Cuba. One of the most important figures in the Spanish conquest was an indigenous woman known as La Malinche, also known by the Spanish name of Doña Maria. She was one of 20 slaves given to Cortés by the Tabascan people in 1519, prior to the conquest. Some legends suggest she may have been royalty. She later became the mistress of Cortés and gave birth to his first son, a boy named Martin. La Malinche's most significant contribution was her extraordinary command of languages. She had picked up Spanish prior to the arrival of Cortés from the appearance of some shipwrecked Spanish sailors. She spoke Nahua, Maya, and several other languages. Her abilities were of huge importance to Cortés, both in terms of information gathering and communicating with potential allies against the Aztecs. One of the principal allies of Cortés were the people of Tlaxcala. Cortés stayed there for 20 days and formed an alliance with them. The Tlaxcalans had been in conflict with the Aztec Empire for decades, so the arrival of the Spanish represented an opportunity to change their geopolitical situation. Cortés was able to add 6,000 Tlaxcala warriors to his ranks, and he arrived in Tenochtitlan in November of 1519. At the time of the arrival of Hernán Cortés, Cholula was second only to Tenochtitlan as the largest city in central Mexico. It had a population of up to 100,000 people. It was a major religious and trade center. In addition to the great temple of Quetzalcoatl and various palaces, the city had over 350 other religious temples. At Cholula, Cortés led an attack against the largely undefended city. This was, again, a major religious site. There's disagreement as to the cause of the violence. Up to 30,000 people were killed by Cortés, the Spanish, and their Tlaxcalan allies. The Tlaxcalans say that an ambassador went to Cholula and was tortured by the Cholulans, and that Cortés avenged his death by attacking Cholula. The Cholulans blame the Tlaxcalans. They say the Tlaxcalans resented Cortés going to Cholula instead of their religious centers. Cortés argued that the Cholulans had treated him with disrespect and needed to be punished, and also that they had set a trap for the Spanish in order to help the Aztecs. Cortés sent word along that the Aztecs did not need to fear his wrath if Moctezuma treated him with respect and gifts of gold. So Moctezuma was well aware of the presence of Cortés, and he prepared for the arrival of the Spanish. The city of Tenochtitlan was founded in 1325 CE. It was the capital of the Aztec Empire. We talked about this in an earlier lesson. Its name translates as "among the prickly pears growing among the rocks." indicating its, at the time, rural environment. The heart of the city was an island of 5 square miles in Lake Texcoco that had been continually expanded through the addition of earthworks built by the Aztecs. It was connected to the mainland, as you can see in this image, by a series of causeways leading north, south, and west. The causeways were intersected by bridges, and canoes and other traffic could pass freely. The bridges could also be removed if necessary to defend the city. They were interlaced with a series of canals inside, so one could get about the city by canal. And all parts of the city could be accessed by either foot or canoe. Among the city's many technological marvels was a levee system completed in the 1450s. This levee kept spring-fed fresh water in the waters around Tenochtitlan and kept the brackish waters beyond the dikes. You can kind of see that in this image off in the distance, the edge of the levee system. The Spaniards, when they arrived, marveled at the size and beauty of the city. Bernal Diaz, a soldier in the army of Cortés who wrote an account titled The Conquest of New Spain, described it as follows. When we saw all those towns and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading to the city, we were astounded. These great towns and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all just a dream. It was all so wonderful, I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never seen of, heard of, or dreamed of before. Moctezuma II was the Aztec emperor at the arrival of the Spanish. His title was Huetlatuani, to be specific, which translates as Great Speaker. Bernal Diaz de Castillo described him as follows. He was about 40 years old, of good height, well-proportioned, spare and slight, and not very dark. He did not wear his hair long, but just over his ears, and he had a short black beard, well-shaped and thin. This image on this slide captures most of that. It seems to leave off the beard, though. The court of Moctezuma II far surpassed comparable royal courts in Europe at the time. Moctezuma had 3,000 servants, 200 guards, and a large group of concubines. No one was allowed to look him in the face or to touch him. According to legend, a comet appeared in the night sky in 1517, and it was supposedly interpreted as evidence of the Quetzalcoatl myth and the god Quetzalcoatl planning his return. And some suggest that the Aztecs and Moctezuma may have conflated the persons of Quetzalcoatl and Cortés. But this comet legend and the legend about Quetzalcoatl may be influenced by the post-conquest world in which the Mexica were trying to seek favor with the Spanish and sort of told them what they wanted to hear. There are differences between the Spanish and Aztec accounts regarding the first meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés. Aztec accounts suggest Cortés bowed before Moctezuma, while Spanish accounts suggest two men who met on more or less equal terms. The Spanish recorded that they met on November 8th of 1519 on the causeway leading into Tenochtitlan and exchanged gifts. We do know that Moctezuma gave Cortés an Aztec calendar of silver and gold, or at least he says he was given that. For all we know, they may have seized it. At this time, the Spanish and their allies in the city numbered about 4,000 men, which was a great strain on the city to house and entertain Cortés and his allies. Now remember that Tenochtitlan at this time was perhaps a city of 200,000 people, so while an army of 4,000 may sound large, in retrospect, it's vastly outnumbered by the population. Cortés briefly left Tenochtitlan to deal with a rival Spanish force that was sent to arrest him, despite being outnumbered 3-1. Cortés defeated Panfilo de Narvaez and the Spanish force that was sent by Governor Velázquez to arrest him. and many of these men ended up joining his army. We now turn to a period while Cortés is away, known as the Tenochtitlan Massacre. While he was away, the remaining Spanish and their allied forces were increasingly on edge. There were rumors of plots by the Aztec to kill the Spanish and their allies. And the backdrop to what became known as the Tenochtitlan Massacre was a traditional Aztec festival held in a temple. Spanish accounts claim that the conquistadors acted to end human sacrifice at the festival, while the Aztec account differs. The Aztecs claim the Spanish were enticed into action by the gold the Aztecs wore. As many as 600 people were killed. Some sources indicate over 1,000 dead. But tellingly, most of these were nobles, military leaders, and political leaders. So you could argue this was sort of a mass coup d'etat and taking out large sectors of the power structure of the Aztec capital. An Aztec account of the massacre indicates this. They surrounded our dancers and then set upon the drummers. One had his hands severed and they struck off his head. They charged the crowd and hacked at us with their iron swords, cutting us to pieces. The blood ran like water, and so the war broke out. Cortés, again, who had been away at the coast, returned to find Tenochtitlan, a city in uproar. And essentially, Moctezuma was being held hostage in his own palace by the Spanish. But remember how outnumbered the Spanish were. So the Spanish were essentially trapped in Moctezuma's palace. So there's this sort of standoff going on. There's different accounts of the death of Moctezuma. Spanish accounts claim Moctezuma was killed by stones thrown at him from the crowd while he spoke on a balcony trying to calm them, while the Aztecs claim the Spanish killed Moctezuma. In the meantime, Moctezuma's brother Cuitlahuac was elected Tlatoani, but he ruled for just 80 days and then died of smallpox. And then Cuauhtemoc took power in 1520 as the successor of Cuitlahuac. He was a cousin of Moctezuma II, and his young wife was one of Moctezuma's daughters. So there's a succession crisis of sorts and a leadership struggle that's going on, and a leadership dearth in some ways that assists the Spanish. Let's turn next to an episode known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. The death of Moctezuma left Cortés and the Spanish in an extremely difficult situation, and Cortés decided to break out of the city. The Spanish attempted to carry away tons of gold and valuables, but they were attacked by the Aztecs in canoes and barges as they left via the causeways. Some exit causeways were destroyed, and several hundred conquistadors and thousands of allies were killed. Cortés and his forces then regrouped in the city of Tlaxcala and then returned with thousands of native allies and Spaniards. The Spanish siege of Tenochtitlan was significantly aided by a smallpox epidemic in 1519 and 1520, in which tens of thousands died in Tenochtitlan in the epidemic. The city of Tenochtitlan finally fell on the 13th of August in 1521. Traditionally, the conquest of the Aztecs attributed the Spanish victory to items like steel swords and armor, as well as the use of guns, horses, and war dogs by the Spanish. The traditional explanations suggest things like superior tactics of the Spanish, the supposed superiority of Spanish culture, and the power of Christianity. But there are certainly more reasons for the fall of the Aztecs. Historians today emphasize other reasons. Certainly the introduction of Eurasian diseases like smallpox devastated indigenous societies. Also, in a political sense, the imperial structure of the Aztecs was a top-down system, and local governance was largely decentralized. So the supplanting of the Spanish in place of the Aztecs at the top of this political pyramid was relatively smooth. Finally, resentments held by many subject peoples against the Aztecs meant that the Spanish had no difficulty finding disgruntled populations to join the fight against the Aztecs. Let's turn next to the conquest of the Inca Empire. This occurred in 1532 and 33 and was led by the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro. The Spanish were aided by two major factors: a deadly smallpox epidemic and a civil war between rival Inca leaders. Francisco Pizarro was the Spanish conquistador who led the Spanish conquest of the Inca. He was born in Spain in 1471 and, like Cortés, was from Extremadura. He was the illegitimate son of a minor noble, and interestingly, he happened to be the second cousin of Cortés. He traveled to Hispaniola in 1502, and he led a series of unsuccessful expeditions to the Pacific coast of South America in the 1520s, finding himself increasingly in debt and testing the patience of the powerful Spanish officials who had been sponsoring his missions to conquer new regions. By the time of the eventual conquest of the Inca, Pizarro was running out of time to make something happen. It is possible he would have been arrested if he returned empty-handed again after this mission. Supposedly, he gathered a small band of soldiers, a little over 100 strong, and gave the following speech: "There lies Peru with its riches. Here, Panama and its poverty. Choose, each man, what becomes best, a brave Castilian." Smallpox hit Peru in the years 1524 to 26 and ravaged the empire, with millions of Inca subjects dying from the disease. Even the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac died, which led to a succession crisis as civil war began between his sons Huascar and Atahualpa. Pizarro successfully exploited the Inca power struggle. He came up with a strategy of holding Atahualpa hostage for ransom. The Spanish insisted that a room be filled with gold and valuables, and they received what they demanded, but they killed Atahualpa anyway. In this power vacuum, Pizarro makes the bold move of proclaiming Peru and the former Inca Empire for Spain, and thus began a 40-year war for formal control of the former Inca Empire. There are a number of reasons for the fall of the Inca. Disease certainly takes a prominent place, as smallpox likely caused the death of millions of Inca subjects, and even the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac died. This led to succession problems and a civil war between factions led by two of Huayna Capac's sons. When the next Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, was held hostage, the empire was essentially paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Finally, resentments of subject peoples also contributed to the problems faced by the Inca, as subject peoples used the opportunity of the Civil War and the arrival of the Spanish to begin to secede from the empire, thus weakening Inca forces. This brings to a close our review of Week 6 materials.